Hello, welcome to your crash course in Romanticism. So, I'm going to do this very quickly. If you had taken regular senior English this year, which I am glad you did not because you're here with me, but if you had, you would have learned about the different various time lines within English literature. In other words, there are different time periods where you had, Beowulf being written in one, right? So that's your medieval time period. And then you had your Shakespearean time period, right? Your Renaissance time period. You had the Enlightenment, you had satire, you have all of that. One time period, which happens to be my favorite, would be the Romantic period. And that period would take place between about 1798 to 1832. And you would have learned about this in regular senior English. Now, one thing that everybody thinks about, and almost everybody is wrong when they think about the Romantic period in English literature, is they think that those 30 or 40 years, all the literature written at that time period was about love and romance. That's not what the Romantic period actually stands for. Romantic literature can be about love, sure, but that's not what makes it romantic. What makes something romantic actually is using your imagination, is breaking the old barriers and rules of literature that it has to be written a certain way, it has to be about a certain thing. No. Romantic poets came in and said, wait a minute, stop. I want to write a ghost story. I want to write a horror story. I want to write a story about magic. I want to write a story about supernatural events. That's romantic literature. So things like your Harry Potter, that's romantic literature, right? Stephen King, Edgar Allan Poe, romantic literature. Why? Because it's supernatural, ghost stories, horror stories, monsters, not villains, but supernatural monsters are. Heck, Star Wars movies, stuff like that, where you're flying around in space. That's also very imaginative. You're using your imagination. And oftentimes there's some kind of supernatural force involved. They use the force, Luke. There's nothing more supernatural than that. So that's a type of romantic literature. Now, allow me to show you something. I'm going to give this to you fast, just so that, if I had you for regular senior English, I would spend a week on this information. I would have you take notes and whatnot. But today, I just want to expose you to it. I want you to know that it exists. So allow me to give you my very quick presentation on romanticism. So hold on one second, please. Here it is right here. So the Romantic period, I'm going to say it again, is from 1798 to 1832, roughly. So any of the literature written during that period is, not all of it, because somebody may have followed the regular rules, but this is when the Romantics really came out. Now, some of the things that's going on during this time, just so you know, historically, there's all kinds of revolutions happening. 1798, what just happened? You had the American Revolution, and I believe there's another one going on in France and all over Europe, right? People are freaking out because the government has too much control. Also because the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. So what did people want at that time? They wanted change. And rather than using reason as their aspect of change, they said imagination is the best thing to talk about for change. We all have these beautiful imaginations, so let's use them. All right, so Romanticism is an artistic, a literary, and an intellectual movement. All right, it's when people, specifically artists mostly, revolted against political reason and social norms, saying, you know what, I'm going to write about whatever I want. Okay, I had a dream, I'm going to write about that dream. In fact, which is pretty cool, we're going to be reading the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which is known as the most romantic poem of all time. And there's very many reasons for it. In fact, we'll go through the list in a minute of what makes something romantic. And the Rime of the Ancient Mariner pretty much checks off all of those list items. So let's keep going. Let's learn a little bit more. All right, Romanticism, again, is not about love. It's about your emotions. It's about questioning traditions and authority. It's about an awareness of change. It's about adapting to change. And by the way, Romantics love nature. They get a lot out of nature, whether or not it's their link to God or their link to themselves. Let's continue. All right, so let's talk about what makes something romantic. A piece of romantic literature is going to be very imaginative. Oh, what I was saying before about the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, it's actually very cool. It's actually based on a dream. Some dude had a dream, and then he told his friend, who happened to be a poet, and he's like, I had this crazy dream. And he describes this dream to his friend, the poet. And his friend's like, that's pretty cool. I'm going to write a story about that. And he and that guy and a couple of other poets, they got together, they chatted it out, and together they came up with this really epic story, which he then turned in and wrote into an epic poem, which It's very famous. You may or may not have heard of the Rime of the Ancient Mariner before today, but I am telling you that in the future, you will be hearing about the Rime of the Ancient Mariner again and again. There's going to be references to it, whether you're watching Jeopardy, Wheel of Fortune, whatever. You will come across references to the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, and you're going to be able to talk about them with intelligence, which is going to be pretty awesome. So imagination is a huge part of any romantic piece of literature. Emotion, in other words, your emotion or the emotions of the characters are actually important, and they talk about them. Also, individuality, personal rights, and judgment, that everybody is an individual, is an important person, but we know all that as well. As Americans, we know this. Let's continue. It's about artistic and political freedom. In other words, people can now write about whatever they want. Want to write a ghost story? Write a ghost story. Want to write a story about a monster that lives in a tree? Do it. That's romantic literature. It's also oftentimes has medieval subjects and settings, whether it's castles and knights. You're going to see that this poem, we don't know when it's set, although you get the feeling like it's set in medieval times, like the 13 or 1400s, but they do use the characters. They use medieval terms, like instead of saying stop, they say stoppeth, or instead of saying three, they say thrice. And it just gives it this air of, I don't know, makes it seem a little bit more poetical and whatnot, and pretty cool, artistic. Let's continue. It has simple language. Oh, this is important. Not only is it written in a simple language so that everybody can understand it, but it's also the words themselves are not, they're not going to use any words or many words that common people can't understand, right? Because they want everybody to find this literature accessible to them, right? So it's not only written about the common people, but it's also written in common language, right? So not only educated people can understand these poems and stories. In fact, everybody likes them because they're so darn cool. I've said this before, nature is a huge deal in romantic literature. So there's going to be a lot of natural settings and elements. This poem is all about nature. In fact, nature and how you treat nature is basically the theme of the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, but we will get to that when we get to that. Let's continue. Number 8 is my favorite, supernatural, mysterious. Of course, there's got to be ghosts. Well, it doesn't have to be, but there could be ghosts and spirits and stuff. You're going to find out that in this poem, there are ghosts, there are spirits, there may or may not be demons, and there are angels in this poem. And they're actually characters, and it's going to be pretty awesome. 9, concern for the oppressed. In other words, it's not only does it talk to the common people, but also it talks about the common people. So oftentimes the characters themselves will be normal, regular people so that the reader can relate to them. Oh, I can relate to them. I'm a poor schlub from, blah, blah, blah as well. Hey, this might be about me as well. It's not, in other words, these stories aren't just about rich people that you can't relate to. Let's continue. 2 more, and then we're done with this. It's also oftentimes the author slips in things about their own life into the novels or into the poems. Like I said, this poem is based upon the author's best friend's dream. So it's not on his life, but it's on his friend's life. And lastly, and I've gone through this already, it's about the common man and about their common life so that everybody can find it, access to these stories and find some kind of believability in it. Not necessarily, hey, I believe in monsters, but hey, this is about a regular poor guy. I'm a regular poor guy. And then it makes it a little bit more interesting to read. Let's continue. Okay, so the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. It's a ghost story that takes place at sea. And very importantly, it's a frame story. And a frame story means there's a story within a story. In other words, we're going to hear the story begin. In fact, let me describe this to you. It's very simple, actually. This story starts off with 3 guys going to a wedding. In fact, they're walking into the building, which happens to be on the seaside. So the water's right there. They're probably on like a boardwalk or something like that. And these 3 guys are walking into the wedding when one old man, they're going to call him the Ancient Mariner. He's like a ship captain. He stops all 3 men. He says, wait right here. 2 of the guys go, technically all 3 of them are like, dude, get out of the way. We're on our way to a wedding. It's starting in a couple of minutes. We need to get inside to this wedding. They're probably all dressed up and whatnot. And the mariner says, no, sit down. I have a story to tell you. Now, 2 of the men are going to say, get out of here, you crazy old dude. And they're going to push right by him and go into the wedding. One of the 3 men is forced to sit down and listen to this story. And how is he forced to listen to this story? The old man looks at him with his glittering eye, and he kind of says, no, sit down. It's almost like he's hypnotizing this man to sit down and listen to his story. And he even says, hey, wait a minute, buddy, I got to get in there. I'm the next of kin. In other words, he's like the brother to the groom. So he's like, I'm part of the wedding. I got to go. Sorry. And he tries to get up and leave again. And the mariner says, no, sit down. And he again looks at him with his eye, his glittering eye, his hypnotic and scary eye, and forces the man, not physically. He doesn't take his hands on him. His eye does it. So it's almost like he's being compelled to do it. And he says, sit down. And the wedding guest is forced to sit down. And that's when the mariner starts telling his story. And the minute he starts telling his story, we then go into his story and we hear about the ship and everything like that. So that's our frame, right? The outside frame is this old man telling this one guy a story outside of a wedding. And the story is the story of the old man on his ship. So at some points, he's going to say some things that are really scary to the man. And the man's going to go, whoa, what are you talking about? And that's when we come out of the story and back to the frame. And how is the old man going to get the guy to listen again every time he tries to interrupt and go into the wedding or get away from this crazy story? You guessed it. He's going to give him the eye, and he's going to force him to sit and listen to his story. So that's a frame story. It's a story within a story. Okay. Let's close this down. Let's go back to me. Okay, now you got my ugly mug again. I apologize for that, but there's nothing I can do about it. And I want to tell you one more thing before we start part 1 of the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Now, actually, let me tell you 2 things. One, when you're looking at the text, whether it's on your computer or you have the paper version of it, you're going to notice that within the stanzas, every few stanzas or outside of the stanzas, there's italicized writing. It's actually kind of cool what happened here. So he wrote this poem, Coleridge and Wordsworth, they wrote this poem together in 1798 and they published it. And a lot of people were like, dude, this is really crazy. This is cool. But we don't necessarily understand everything you're trying to say. What do you mean when you're talking about these South Pole spirits or these ghosts under the water? So what they did, Samuel Coleridge did, is very cool, is he rewrote the poem and he republished it about 10 or 15 years later. I think it was 10 years later. And what he did was he gave these little synopsises, these little summaries of what he was describing off to the side in italics. Now, some of the versions have it off to the side. Some of the versions have it in between the stanzas. Either way. So what they're there to do, it's not extra information. It's describing what he's describing a little more in depth. So it's just giving you more information for you to understand. So after reading it the second time with all those italics, people are like, oh, I get this now. So it's just a way to help people to understand his poem. I'll go over those as we're reading these things. One more thing you have to understand. And again, just like Catholicism in the Catholic Church, I'm not telling you to believe this. I'm just telling you that it's part of the story. And certainly the guys who wrote it believed this stuff or wanted to make us think that they believed what I'm about to describe to you. So you cannot understand the Rime of the Ancient Mariner without understanding this concept. So Samuel Coleridge and these romantics, they had the belief, or they wanted us to believe they had the belief, that around the world, around the globe, there are certain spirits which control certain sections of the globe. It's like their domain. They're like the mayor of this section or the governor of this section. And they're in charge, these spirits, these invisible spirits. Well, invisible if they want to be invisible, but they can make themselves visible to the person if they want to, whether for good or for ill. But these invisible spirits are in charge of that portion of the globe, specifically the nature of that globe. So for example, you might have a North Pole spirit, and the North Pole spirit is in charge of all the animals and all of the nature, the storms, the winds, the waters, the land, the animals, the polar bears, the penguins, the spirits are in charge of these sections. So there's a North Pole spirit, there's an equator spirit, there's a South Pole spirit, there's probably an Atlantic Ocean spirit, there's a Pacific Ocean spirit, there's a Nile river spirit, there's a Delaware River spirit. And these spirits are in charge of all the nature in that section that they are in charge of. Now, who do these spirits work for? Who do they I don't know, who do they take their orders from? Can anybody guess? Spirits, who do they work for? God. They believe, these romantics, they want us to think that these sections of the earth are controlled by spirits who then are controlled, or not controlled necessarily, but work for, or I don't know, how's the word that I'm looking at? The work of, they're like the assistant to God, whatever, but they work for God. Now, if you anger one of these South Pole, or whatever spirits, North Pole spirit, South Pole spirit, any of them, by either being a bad person, bad to nature, for whatever reason, bad to God, bad to yourself, these South Pole spirits are going to come after you, right? And they're going to make you suffer, whether it's in the form of a penance or a punishment of some kind. Now that you know that, this idea, and by the way, I'm not telling you to believe this stuff. I'm just telling you to understand it for the purposes of this poem and for romantics themselves. Now that you know this poem should make a lot more sense. So again, two things to talk about. One, this is a frame story. What's the frame? An old man stops three guys going into a wedding and says, sit down, listen to my story. Two of them were like, get out of here, you crazy old dude. One of them is forced to listen because the man says, ooh, sit down, listen to my story. He uses the glittering eye. A few times, oh, by the way, the minute he does that, we're going to go into the story and you're going to hear about them getting on their ship and them sailing down to the equator. So you're seeing inside his story. So that's inside the frame. Every once in a while, the wedding guest is going to try to break out of this and either get to the wedding or just get away from this crazy old dude. And what's the guy going to do? My eye, sit down, go. And he's going to make him listen with his glittering eye. And we're going to go back into the story. The second thing you need to understand in order to understand the Rime of the Ancient Mariner is that this whole idea of the spirits controlling different portions of the earth and specifically controlling the nature, the animals and the beasts in that section, and they work specifically for God. The last thing, and then I'm done with my introduction for Romanticism and Rime of the Ancient Mariner. This may or may not be a vampire story. I'm not going to tell you what I believe because I have a definitive belief. I've read this poem. Oh my gosh. I've taught it for 20 years now. This will be probably about 15 years. And I love it. I will say that for the first 5, 6, 7 years, maybe 8 years that I taught this poem, I didn't really understand it that well. Why? Because I didn't understand about the South Pole spirits and all that. I didn't understand that whole spirit thing. But now that I do, it makes more sense. Also, the more you read something, the more you get it. Now, 15 years in, I've got this poem. I love this poem. Do you have to love this poem? Absolutely not. You just have to understand it. But I will say it was an awesome day. It was a wild, I was like, whoa. The day that I was looking up about 5, 7 years ago when I was creating this class and I was looking up vampire poetry. And I looked up, I made a list of the best vampire poems in the history of man. The Rime of the Ancient Mariner came up on several of the lists that I was reading. And I had already been reading the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, and I never put it together, two and two together. Oh my gosh, this might be a vampire story. And then once I read about it and I realized it, it all started to click into place for me. And I got the idea of whether or not it was or was not a vampire story. I also remember texting my boss and saying, dude, did you know that this is and she went, oh my God, I think it might be. Because she too, my boss, Miss Moran, had been teaching. She used to be a senior English teacher as well before she was our supervisor. And she too said, whoa, I think there might be. And we went through all the different reasons why we think it might be. So again, at the end of this, you're going to tell me, is it a vampire story? Give me 3 reasons why and 3 quotes why. Is it not a vampire story? Give me 3 reasons why and 3 quotes why. Or of course, it isn't a vampire story, but you could see why somebody would think that it was. And give me 3 reasons why. Fabulous. All right, I'm going to stop this now, and we're going to start part 1. What we'll do is, this is a long poem. It's actually 7 parts. We're going to do it a part at a time. Should take about 10 or 15, maybe 20 minutes for me to teach you each part. And then at the end of each part, take down your notes, decide whether or not what you think. But I'm going to tell you now, You must wait until the end of this poem before you actually make that decision of whether or not this is a vampire poem or not. So jot down notes as you're going along, highlight and copy and paste whatever, possible, question marks and whatnot. And then at the end, we'll put it all together and you will make up your mind whether or not you think this is a vampire story. You can't get that wrong, by the way. That's a subjective choice, and based upon the evidence that you give, whether or not you believe it is or it isn't, that's going to make it so. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoy this poem as much as I do.